بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to lesson number 17 from this set of lessons in which we are studying the book by the great Imam Abdul Rahman bin Ahmad bin Abdul Ghaffar al-Iji al-Shirazi rahimahullah ta'ala wa nafa'ana bih. As we know, this text is called Akhlaq al-Adudiya. This is a text in which we are studying the virtues and the vices in order that we can know what the virtues are and know what the vices are, so that we can do what we can to attain the virtues and to rid ourselves of the vices. The book began, as we know, with an introduction into human psychology. What were the faculties of the soul? We know that the soul now, according to Islamic theology, it has three faculties. The faculty of the rational intellect, the faculty of anger, and the faculty of desire or shahwa. And each of these faculties have their virtues and their sub-virtues as well. Alhamdulillah, in the first part of our lessons, we have covered the virtue and sub-virtues of of the rational intellect. And the virtue of the rational intellect was wisdom, along with its sub-virtues. Now we've reached another part of the book, in which we are now studying the virtues of courage. The virtue of courage and its sub-virtues. And courage is the virtue of the faculty of anger. And as we know, Allah created within our souls anger for a purpose. And the purpose of that is to protect ourselves. So we do get angry for a reason. But once again, when we speak about a godly anger is not a demonic anger, but rather a godly anger is a balanced anger, in which it lies behind the intellect and it lies behind the Sharia. So it is guided by the Sharia, it is guided by the intellect, and that is what we call a godly anger. And that godly anger results in the virtue called courage. And we've studied in some detail the virtue of courage, and last week as well we touched on the first sub-virtue of courage, which was the virtue of what we call kibrun nafs, the greatness of soul. And we can define that according to the translation here, and this is the translation of the text by Imam al-Iji. Namely, greatness of soul is regarding scarcity and prosperity, superiority and inferiority as insignificant. And this is not anything new, because we know that scarcity and prosperity, what is that? That is essentially wealth. And superiority and inferiority, this is in relation to fame. And we know that wealth and fame, these are typical examples of the dunya. And the dunya in the sense in which it is matters of the world which distract us from the akhirah. And it's quite interesting that the first sub-virtue of courage is in fact greatness of soul. Because if you think about it, it does take courage, right? It does take courage to direct your efforts away from what is immediately apparent to you in this dunya. Be it gathering wealth, or be it gathering status amongst other people. It takes courage for you to leave that and instead go and build your efforts for the next life. So essentially, as we know, just to repeat that, greatness of soul is to recognize the unimportance of wealth and fame. So let's read a little bit from the commentary of Imam al-Istanbuli, one of the commentators of this text. He says in the Arabic, Bismillah wal muradu min كبر النفس أن لا يكون لشيء من هذه الأمور اعتبار عنده بحيث يحصل الفرح أو الترح كما يؤثر في النفوس الضعيفة تأثيرا يؤدي إلى الانقباض والانبساط. So he says here, what is intended by greatness of soul is that these matters, right? What are these matters? We said wealth and fame. Wealth and fame has no consideration according to him, according to this person, this great-souled person. بحيث, such that no joy, no any distress occurs as a result of wealth or fame. كما يؤثر في النفوس الضعيفة. But he also says that the weaker, souls that are weaker, they are affected by these matters, affected by matters of wealth, affected by matters of status, such that it causes them to be in a state of inqibad, a state of distress, or inbisat, a state of joy and openness. So clearly, there's no jokes about it here. This is a very, very high level of soul, right? Because the everyday person, because a human, when they're born, as they grow up, their nafs or their soul is attached to matters of the dunya, right? Attached to comfort, attached to ease, attached to wealth. So it's a process, right? Remember, whenever we're speaking about akhlaq, we speak about these great virtues, right? We speak about stories. For example, we've heard about, we know great stories of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum who gave out, their entire wealth, or half of their wealth, or huge caravans, right? But these, right, let's not take these examples as things that we have to be right now, right? These are examples, these are heroic, these are examples of our heroes. These are our role models, where we take them. These are amazing people. They lived in a time which we consider miraculous, right? They also lived with a miraculous prophet, the great Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it resulted in miraculous character traits. And these are great examples for us to look up to. But when we think of our own selves, what do we think? We think of akhlaq as a process, right? So when we reflect on this virtue, right, of greatness of soul, which is to, consider dunya, consider wealth, and even the wealth in the absence of wealth, fame in the absence of fame, as unimportant and the same, right? So in such a way where these things actually shouldn't affect ourselves, in the sense that it should not give us too much joy, in fact no joy at all, and it should not give us any grief or distress. But once again, I said this is a very high level. So what do we do with that, right? We reflect on our lives. For example, we are all children of the modern world. Think about what in your everyday life gives you joy, and what in your everyday life gives you distress, right? And it's going to be a balance, right? It's going to be some matters of the dunya will give you joy and distress, right? And some matters of the akhirah will give you joy and distress, right? So it's kind of like, so for example, when you come to the masjid and you pray and it gives you joy, this is a good thing, because this is a matter now which is attached to the akhirah, and you want to build this joy, right? You want to build this attachment of yourself to these matters. But for example, when you're at work, for example, and then you do a really great thing. You do a good job, with your work. For example, you completed a task and you were quite happy with yourself, but then you didn't get praised from your colleagues, for example. There was no fame in that, and then you got sad, right? Well, now this is a matter of the dunya, and so you should recognize that, okay, that this fame or this praise which you expected was something connected to the dunya, and in fact, the praiseworthy thing to do is to be indifferent about this fame, be indifferent about this praise. So, and to reflect on that, reflect on your emotions when someone doesn't praise you, you kind of think about that. Why did I feel distressed? Why did I feel sad? And in the end, in essence, it comes down to connection to too much of a connection to the dunya versus not sufficient of a connection to seeking matters of the akhirah. And this is how and this is, bit by bit, every day, reflecting on your emotions, reflecting on how you feel, how much are you connected with the akhirah, how much are you connected with the dunya. This constant, this is what we call spiritual exercise. This is this mujahada, as we know the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, al-mujahidu man jahada nafsah, right? The mujahid, the true mujahid, is the one who struggles with himself. And this is a constant struggle. It doesn't stop, right? But once again, this is what life is all about. This is the purpose of life, and essentially the highest things, highest matters that we can ascribe to. So as you mentioned, wealth and status, are not important in and of themselves, right? They're not important in and of themselves, but it is important to recognize their unimportance. Why is that? Because we want to recognize that what is important is the akhirah. I just wanted to bring out one point here as well, and that is that we were discussing these concepts of recognizing your emotions, recognizing your thought patterns with respect to matters of the dunya, matters of the akhirah, right? What we need to know in terms of this whole process of refinement of our character is that refinement of character does not mean becoming someone who has no emotion, right? This is not a recognized this is not a recognized concept in Islam. Unfortunately, modern if you could say modern culture has inherited particular ideas from past cultures, where, for example, there were a people in ancient Greece. They were called the Stoics, and they actually made claims that things like fear, things like anger, these emotions are actually blameworthy. As in, a person of virtue, right? A person of high virtue does not have these emotions. But as Muslims, we don't believe that. Rather, the process, right? The process of refinement of character is balancing these emotions so that they come under the Sharia and come under the intellect. Because as we mentioned, right? Allah created these emotions within us for a purpose, and we need to direct these emotions for these purposes. Okay, so that was a very quick revision of what we covered in terms of greatness of soul, right? And we said, what was the definition of greatness of soul again? For someone to recognize that wealth and fame is insignificant. Now, the scholars of Akhlaq, and particularly now, this is the great Imam Adudiya, he mentions that two virtues grow out of greatness of soul. So someone who recognizes that the dunya, right, that the dunya is insignificant, and by extension recognizes that essentially the akhirah is of utmost importance, two new virtues grow out of that. We'll begin with the first one. The virtue that grows out of being someone who has a great soul is a virtue called high-mindedness. Izam al-himma. What is the definition of izam al-himma? In the Arabic, it is adam al-mubalat بسعادة الدنيا وشقاوتها. And this is, once again, this is an extremely lofty virtue. What is it? It is defined as, namely, being unconcerned. Adam al-mubalah, right? Being unconcerned about this world's, as in the dunya, this world's felicity and misery. And to be primarily concerned with the akhirah. And as we mentioned, this takes courage, right? So let's read a little bit more from the commentary of Tosh Kubrizada. He continues and he says, what is a bit more detail about this virtue of high-mindedness? He says, أي لا يستبشر بالملائمات الدنيوية ولا يتضجر على منافراتها الدنيوية حتى الموبقات. I.e., he says, okay, this person does not become very joyful with matters which are agreeable, dunyawi matters which are agreeable, nor does he become too distressed or annoyed with disagreeable matters of the dunya, even extremely distressful matters. And what's an example of that? And this is an example from the Quran. This is the story of Sayyidina Musa and the sorcerers and the magicians, right? So in which Allah says in the Holy Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم قال الله حكاية عن أصحاب موسى في جواب. Okay, so firstly, Fir'aun says, as we know the story, right? They were Pharaoh gathered all of the sorcerers, and then gathered with them Musa alayhi salam, and they had a competition. And the sorcerers began first, and they had their show of their snakes, and then Musa alayhi salam had his stick, and he cast his stick, and he became a snake, and it ate up all of the sorcerer's snakes. So then what happened? That the sorcerers, they became Muslim, and they affirmed the belief of Sayyidina Musa in Rabbil Alameen, in the Lord of the worlds. But this obviously was not according to the plans of Pharaoh, of Fir'aun. So what does he say? He threatens them with something very, very, very horrible. Not just death, but what does he say? فَلَأُقَطِّعَنَّ أَيْدِيَكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ مِنْ خِلَافٍ وَلَأُصَلِّبَنَّكُمْ فِي جُذُوعِ النَّخْلِ. So he says, I will certainly cut off your hands and feet on opposite sides, and can crucify you on the trunks of palm trees. So this is, this is not just death, but this is death in a horrible way, and a mutilation of the body. But what do the sorcerers say in response to that? And this is an example of what it means for people to have عظم الهمة, the virtue of high-mindedness, in which they say, قالوا, they say, لا ضير إنا إلى ربنا منقلبون. That would be no harm. Surely to our Lord we will all return. So they recognize the insignificance of the dunya, and they know that where they are going, they know that they are traveling to the akhirah. And they also say, فَقْضِ مَا أَنْتَ قَادٍ إِنَّمَا تَقْضِي هَذِهِ الْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا. So do whatever you want. These are the sorcerers saying these very powerful words. So do whatever you want. Your authority only covers the fleeting life of this world. And that is an affirmation of the insignificance of the dunya, and that in the end Allah is Maliki Yawmiddin. He is the king and the master of the day of judgment. So that's that's a very clear example, right? A very high and extremely lofty example of high-mindedness. And that's these are examples of our heroes that we always have to keep in mind. But what are more, you could say, examples which are closer, right? Examples which are closer to our everyday experience. Okay, what are some examples of matters which are disagreeable disagreeable in the dunya? And for someone who is high-minded, they wouldn't be so concerned about it, right? So matters of the body. So, for example, if some people, they are faced with chronic health issues, a lot of pain, but they're not too concerned about that. But what do I mean by they're not too concerned about it? It doesn't mean they don't do anything about it. Why? Because the person of virtue is guided by Allah's commands, right? The person of virtue is guided by Allah's commands. So they always, at every moment in time, they always want to do what Allah wants them to do at that moment. So the person of virtue who faces a lot of health issues, right? What would they do? They wouldn't be complaining, they'd be accepting. They wouldn't be too concerned about these health issues, but they know that when someone is sick, it is important that they seek treatment. So they seek treatment for their health, not because, right? Not because they want to get out of their sickness. Why? Because they accept God's decree that they are sick. But they follow God's command to seek treatment, because Allah wants people who are sick to seek treatment. So it's very subtle, it's very interesting, where a person who is high-minded, and when they're sick, they might seek treatment, right, in medicine for their sickness, but they're doing it for a very different reason. They're doing it because Allah wants them to do that. And they're not doing it because they feel that it's important for them to be, to get out of their sickness, right? So it's an interesting subtle point that perhaps you can reflect more upon. But what is more important, as what I'm saying, what is more important for the person of virtue is not matters of the dunya, right? But rather matters of the akhirah, and how does someone act in order that they may further matters of akhirah, follow God's commands, right? So it's an interesting subtle distinction. Another example, maybe this is a bit easier for us to imagine. Someone who is not able-bodied, someone who's disabled. Let's say they were born missing a limb, born missing a leg, or maybe they were born blind, right? Parts of their bodies weren't working. So a high-minded person would not be too concerned about that, but rather they would accept their body as it is, and then they would follow God's commands to the best of their ability. Likewise, matters of wealth and comfort, right? The presence of wealth, the absence of wealth, the presence of comfort, the absence of comfort. The high-minded person is not too concerned about that. Rather, what are they concerned about? Let's read a little bit here. This is from another commentator, Imam al-Kazaruni. He says, بل يكون في طلب الجميل الحقيقي والكمال النفساني. Right? Rather, this person, let's say he was blind, they would rather be seeking al-jamil al-haqiqi, the true thing of beauty. And we know that al-jamil al-haqiqi, this is Allah. And al-kamal al-nafsani, this is the perfection of the soul, right? Whether it's through ethical virtues, right? This is one of them, or whether it's through devotional virtues. What's an example of devotional virtue? Prayer, right? That's an example of a devotional virtue. That we also have mystical virtues, right? Such as shukr, gratitude gratitude as a spiritual virtue. There is love of Allah, that's a spiritual virtue, right? So the person who is high-minded would not be too concerned about their blindness, but rather be more concerned about seeking Allah and seeking and seeking perfection in their soul. And we know, for example, that the great Imam al-Haddad, rahimahullah ta'ala, he was blind, right? He couldn't see. But as they say, the ulama say, he didn't have basar, but he had basira. He didn't have sight, but he had spiritual insight. So with that, we will end our lesson, insha'Allah ta'ala, where we covered the first, a slight revision of the virtue of greatness of soul, and also the first branch out of greatness of soul, which is to be high-minded. Idam al-himma, which we have mentioned, is to be unconcerned about the world's felicity and misery, right? And to be primarily concerned with the akhirah. And insha'Allah ta'ala, next week, we will cover the third sub-virtue of courage, and also the second branch out of the second branch out of greatness of soul, which is patience and perseverance. So we'll end here. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.